perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. It's the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Those of you who are not currently a practicing Catholic, we know that you've got questions and we are here to provide some answers if you'll give us a call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside the U.S. and Canada, please dial the USA country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. You can always shoot us an email 24/7. ctc@ewtn.com is the address. Well, we've got the A-team ready to hear from you. Charles Beery, our producer, Ryan Penny, our phone screener, Jeff Burson on social media, who will also pass along any questions that you want to pose via YouTube or Facebook Live, because we're streaming there right now. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, Tom. How are you?
And you know what? I'm doing great. I got my tea. You've got your tea. I think we are ready to rock and roll. And David, let me ask you a question I already know the answer to. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Would you mind taking an email from someone who disagrees with you?
I would not mind.
Excellent. I knew that was going to be the answer. Here it is, and this is from Trent. Hi, I know you first built your life around Protestantism and were misled by the hyper-grace itching ears doctrine, neglecting the walking in righteousness and carrying our cross daily. As a historian, you missed the tie of the Catholic Mary connection with Ishtar, Isis, Diana, and Cybele? Whatever. The Third Ecumenical Council of Ephesus was the point wherein the, quote, Mother of God was appropriated to Mary, to cheers of the pagans in that town. This is a notice from the living God to cease and desist promotion of the cult that is the Roman Catholic Church. Repent and return to the Father, the only Father, and His Son, Jesus Christ. And that's signed Trent. There you go.
Well, all right then.
All right then.
Thanks, Trent. I appreciate the question. It's not really a question. I guess it's an admonition.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I appreciate the admonition. I beg to differ, and I don't really believe that the Catholic doctrine or devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary is simply a borrowing from pagan goddess cults. Far from it. And you know, I'll make a brief case for that, and of course, I don't expect to persuade you in one phone call, but why I'm very happy and comfortable being Catholic, along with my devotion to the Blessed Mother. So, when I was coming to Catholic faith, of course, Mary was a stumbling block for me, as it is for many Protestants. Mm-hmm. And my first move on this actually was not Mariology; it was the question of communion of saints, broadly conceived. And I was reading a book by the secular historian Peter Brown, who's an expert on late antiquity, on the cult of saints in Latin Christianity, ancient Christianity. And Brown made a point that really struck me. He said that you could trace the progress of Christianity in the ancient world by tracing the cult of martyrs and saints, archaeologically. And I've since learned he's not the only historian to take that point of view. Ramsay MacMullen, another historian of late antiquity, makes basically the same point. And that in the ancient world, Christianity and devotion to the saints was coextensive. They were coextensive. In other words, you couldn't find one without the other. And so I had to wrestle with that as a Protestant with this realization that I could reject devotion to saints, but I couldn't do that and claim any continuity with Christian antiquity. But if I were to accept Christian antiquity, I was going to have to come to terms with devotion to the saints. Making the same point, St. Jerome, 4th century doctor of the Church, wrote a treatise against a fellow named Vigilantius, who was a critic of Catholic devotion to the saints in that era. And Jerome says to Vigilantius, he says, do you really think that the Bishop of Rome does wrong? And not only the Bishop of Rome, but all of the bishops throughout the entire world? When he offers the holy sacrifice, of course, speaking here of the sacrifice of the Mass, over the bones of the holy martyrs Peter and Paul, making the very same point that, like, look, you can throw this out, but if you do, you better throw out any claim to continuity with historic Christianity. So then I was challenged, well, how do I make sense of this? How do I integrate that into my conception of Christianity, if I even attempt to do so? And so I read more deeply, and I realized that far from being a holdover from paganism, the pagans themselves were deeply opposed to Christian devotion to the saints, particularly because of its being tied up with relics. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to the Blessed Virgin, but it does apply to the martyrs. Because, see, for paganism, dead bodies are things that you keep far away from the gods in religious worship. But it was integral to the Christian understanding of resurrection from the dead and the sanctity of the body. And then I come to find out that this is part and parcel of Second Temple Judaism as well. It predates the Christian faith. And I read books by fellows like Joachim Jeremias in his treatise on the cult of the dead in Second Temple Judaism. And I begin to see that this is grounded in a very Hebraic and biblical understanding of the body and of the next life. And I see it reflected in the New Testament in passages like Revelation chapter 5, where the saints in heaven are interceding for the church on earth, or in 2 Maccabees chapter 15, or the book of Tobit. And I said, this stuff is far more integral to my understanding of the faith. And then I began to see how Christ himself teaches that we are members of his body in a mystical sense, and that when we're joined to him in baptism, we actually become participants in the work of redemption. That's what St. Paul says. We're Christ's co-laborers, as if God was making his appeal through us. And the prayer of a righteous man avails much, James says in chapter 5 of his epistle. All of a sudden, my head just exploded. And I said, wow, there is something deeply, deeply, profoundly biblical and sensible about this Catholic doctrine. Then I began to fit the Blessed Virgin into that picture and read what the 2nd century fathers had to say about Mary as the second Eve.
All right.
And the rest, as we say, was history.
Yes, indeed. Hey, Trent, thank you so much for your email. Very thoughtful. We appreciate that. In a moment, we'll talk with Alice in Columbus City, Oklahoma. Hopefully you as well at 833-288-EWTN. Do stay with us.
If you're currently an EWTN media missionary or just interested in becoming one, we've got some great news. EWTN Media Missionaries has a new and improved website, EWTNmissionaries.com, designed with you in mind. Our new site is loaded with great features and it's easy to navigate. There are so many different ways that you can help EWTN. Join us in sharing the eternal word with the world. Visit EWTNmissionaries.com today.
Father Benedict Rochelle.
Some great people have shown respect for God. Can I read you a little quotation from Albert Einstein, who many times showed a great respect for religion and was one of the great admirers of Pope Pius XII for his stand against the Holocaust during the Second World War. Einstein wrote, "The fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It's the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of all true art and science. A knowledge of the existence of something we can't penetrate, of the manifestations of the profoundest reason and the most radiant beauty, which are only accessible to our minds in the most elementary form. It is this knowledge and this emotion that constitute the truly religious attitude." Oh my, so beautifully said.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
Hey, we have a great show cooked up for you tomorrow morning. It's the Sunrise Morning Show at 6 a.m. Eastern. Father Joshua Johnson joins Annie and Matt to discuss the Rosary for Racial Healing. I bet you've never thought about that. Check it out tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Eastern. It's the Sunrise Morning Show right here on EWTN Radio. And if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin here with Alice in Columbus City, Oklahoma, listening on the great Oklahoma Catholic Radio. She's a first-time caller. Hey, Alice, what's on your mind today?
It was not Columbus City.
It is not Columbus City.
It's Oklahoma City.
Oklahoma City. I'm so sorry. How can we help you today?
Okay. I prayed for a 3-year-old that died she was not baptized. The family's not Catholic. The child had been in a coma for quite some time after ingesting methadone at a babysitter. It's been a long trial, I'm sure, for the family, but everybody was praying for a miracle. It didn't happen, and I'm still praying for her. How do I pray for her?
Oh,
And what happens to the child? What happens to this baby?
Sure. Oh, what a heartbreaking story. I'm so sorry. So you can pray for this child the way you would pray for any soul, that God would have mercy on her and bring her to heaven. And in terms of what happens to her, when we have an infant like this who has been baptized, we have that assurance that the child has received the gift of new life in Christ, sanctifying grace, remission of original sin, all the rest of it, and that gives us great hope and confidence. But the absence of baptism should not lead us to despair, far from it, because we trust in the mercy of God. And we know that this child died long before the age of reason and any real true culpability for personal sin. So this is the mind of the church now. Pope Benedict wrote about this particular issue, and we have great reason for hope and confidence in God's mercy in this kind of case. So, I think you could pray for the child and safely pray to the child. Yeah. Without trying to be presumptuous, I lean on the side of imagine that this kid has made it to heaven, right? Because no personal sin, no personal fault here. And what was lacking in terms of the ability or willingness of the parents to bring the child to the sacraments can certainly be made up for by God in some extraordinary or extra-sacramental way. And that's really where the church has gone in its thinking on the question of the death of unbaptized infants. Not that we don't want to apply baptism. We want all the goods of baptism for a child. And one of them, of course, is washing away original sin, gift of sanctifying grace, but also membership in the body of Christ, which is the church, is another one of those great goods that comes along with baptism, that baptismal character imprinted on our soul, making us belong to the people of God and have all the rights and privileges that come therewith. And the priesthood that we receive in baptism to be priests. So a lot of benefits that come in addition to that confidence and assurance of God's grace. But I think keep on doing what you're doing and be quite hopeful and how merciful as well towards those poor suffering parents.
Alice, God bless you for your concern. Thank you again for your phone call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986, the Tuesday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Got a great email here from Nick, who says, "Hey guys, love your show. I'm a big fan. What exactly was Mass like before we had a Bible? I'm thinking they had some scripture that was passed down from the original apostles, but when did the rules come in that definitely described what a Mass should consist of? Thanks, Nick."
Okay, thanks. So we have elements of the Mass, of course, present in sacred Scripture, giving thanks, the reading of sacred texts. I mean, Christ Himself would have spoken from the Psalms, from the Psalter in the upper room. The bread and the wine, the words of consecration, distribution of the elements. So many of the core features that we have in the Mass have been there from the beginning. And we know from the oral tradition of the Church and the writings of the Church Fathers that even things like the epiclesis, which is the invocation of the Holy Spirit and so forth, those are also of apostolic origin. And so the reading of sacred text has always been a part of the thing, even before the compilation of the New Testament canon. And in fact, that was the basis for the Church's determination about which books should go in the canon, right? The Church Fathers said, well, which books have been read in the churches during Mass, which books have been a part of the liturgical celebration from the apostolic era. And if a book had sort of universal acclaim that way across the Catholic world, that was a pretty good indication that it ought to belong in the sacred canon.
Okay. And we do appreciate that. Nick, thank you so much for your call or your email there. Here's a question from Henry watching us on YouTube. He says, in matters of eschatology, is it correct to call Catholics amillennials or something else that might be more appropriate title?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So certainly a lot of Catholics take what you might call an amillennial position on the interpretation of apocalyptic literature in the New Testament and the Old Testament. And that's, I'd say, the dominant point of view among Catholic thinkers, but it's not the only one, and there are other positions that are allowable. So in the 17th century, the number of Jesuit apologists actually were the first to articulate the theory that is now known as Preteritism. So let me define these terms so you know what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So, in the book of Revelation, we read a lot about the end times, and one of the things we read about in Revelation 20, we read about this 1,000-year period that Christ comes back and reigns on earth for 1,000 years. And some of our Protestant friends, so-called premillennialists, believe that refers to Jesus coming back and setting up a physical kingdom in Jerusalem where he literally reigns from a throne on planet Earth for 1,000 years before the end of time. And that has not been the dominant way of understanding that text throughout church history. And it's not the way that even early Protestants understood it. John Calvin, Martin Luther, these guys didn't read that this way. Rather, they understood the 1,000 years as being a type, a symbol for the age of the church, that Christ is ruling now. King Jesus is ruling over the church in the hearts of men, and his spiritual influence is pervading the world and bearing fruit, and will do so until the end of time. So, amillennial meaning, not a literal millennium.
Okay.
There are other ways of reading the text. So, when early Protestants began to hurl the accusation that the Pope was the Antichrist, and that some of these horrible events that unfold in the book of Revelation were actually realized in the Catholic Church, that was the Protestant position. Some creative Jesuit biblical scholars got to work and realized that a lot of these events in the book of Revelation seemed to correspond to stuff that happened in the first century. And they came up with the idea that, well, maybe these things have already happened. Maybe they happened in ancient church history, right? And that's the position now called Preteritism. And that's, Catholics that hold that. My own personal view is I kind of blend those two. I really do think that a lot of the apocalyptic texts in the New Testament refer to events that took place in the first century, but I also see those as types of behavior, of spiritual experience that characterize every age, which is why it's so easy for somebody to pick up the book of Revelation and either derive a lot of benefit or do a lot of damage, right? Because it's so easy to pinpoint, hey, this guy in my present circumstance, this present civilization, he looks like the guy in the book of Revelation, must be the Antichrist. Well, St. John says many Antichrists have come. Many of them have come, and we'll get a lot more. And in terms of days and hours, God knows. God knows. I promise you this, though. We're closer now to the end than we've ever been.
There you go. It is called to Communion here on EWTN. We have a line open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Ricaldo is listening to us on YouTube. He says, why doesn't the church support divorce?
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. Well, let's qualify that statement a little bit, okay? If somebody comes after you with an axe and says, I'm going to hack you up and kill you, and the only way you can get away from that person is to civilly divorce them, the church would support that, right? And, I have this situation happen to a relative of mine who, another relative of mine, these people are both dead, so I'm not telling tales on the living, went after him with an axe.
Wow.
And a fella called my dad up and said, Louis, so-and-so standing at the door with an axe trying to kill me. And Dad said, so-and-so, I don't sleep with her trying to kill me. I'd get out of there pretty quick,
That's right.
And there are a lot of other reasons why a civil divorce might be justifiable, right? That's one. Obviously, physical violence or threats of violence. You got to get out of there. Got to get out of there. And you may need to get the civil power, the police, the courts to come in and protect you. Let's say you have a spouse that's on drugs, and bringing that stuff in the house and exposing it to your children, and they could die. We just had a call a minute ago about a child that was exposed to something like that, and it caused the child's death. You got to get that out of the house. You may have to file a civil divorce to make that happen. Let's take another case. Let's say you have a spouse that promises to practice the Catholic faith, raise the children in the faith, and then 2 days after the honeymoon says, well, it was all a fake. I didn't mean it. It's all a fake. I didn't mean it. And I got no intention of raising the kids in the faith, and, I'm going to raise them to worship the mystic hamburger god or something, right? And I'm going to bring that into this relationship, and I'm going to wreak havoc with you and your children and this Catholic faith thing. Well, that would be another reason. You got to get out of there for the sake of the spiritual well-being of the children. You may have to get out of there. So a lot of occasions when a Catholic might have to have recourse to a civil divorce. So, but what is the position? If you have a valid marriage, where the spouses are really capable of making the kind of promises that you have to make sincerely, right, to live and practice the Catholic faith, or at least respect the other person's right to do so, make a vow of lifelong fidelity, better and worse, sickness, health, rich, poor, all that good stuff. And you have the knowledge to do it, you have the psychological capacity to do it, and you do it in a solemn way in front of the church or her witnesses, and it's genuinely a valid marriage, then that relationship cannot be broken, because what God has joined together, man can't separate. And it's good to keep that in mind, because everybody experiences difficulties and sufferings in marriage. And what kind of a world would it be? Well, we already know because we're living in it, right?
Yeah.
Where somebody would think, well, hey, I'm not happy. I'm out of here. I don't care what it does to you. I don't care what it does to the kids. I don't care what it does to civilization. This is all about me. The Catholic Church says, marriage is not all about you. Marriage is about the society that comes into being when you marry, called the family. And that's bigger than you. And then that society in the context of a larger society, which is the church and civilization. And that's a lot bigger than you. And you've got a job to do as a married person. Replenish society. Bring children into the world. Raise them, sometimes at great personal cost. Maybe the cost of your own subjective happiness. And that's a noble thing to do. And you need the gumption and stick-to-itiveness to stay in there and do your job. Otherwise, like the Protestant pastor I used to know who said he would only counsel people if they promised to burn their parachutes. You got to burn your parachute.
Yep.
Now if the guy goes crazy, you might, have to have one of those civil divorces. But it doesn't mean that you get a pass on the validity of marriage, and you may have to remain separated until you can be reconciled.
Ricaldo, thanks so much for your note here via YouTube. So it is called to communion here on EWTN. Lines open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here's an anonymous question posed via YouTube. Can an argument be made that Eusebius may have been a full preterist, or did he ever speak of a final return of Jesus?
Okay, thanks. So I'd have to actually dig into Eusebius on the doctrine of the second coming. I definitely believe. Well, first of all, even the preterists today, except the most radical Protestant preterist, of course, confess the doctrine of Christ's second coming, because this is in the creed. This is part of the Catholic faith. And I hadn't actually investigated, but I'm presuming that Eusebius was fully orthodox on that. Now, where Eusebius was different from Augustine, and Augustine really is considered sort of the father of amillennial theology. Augustine, particularly in City of God, had a vision of history where things were waxing and waning all the time. Good periods, bad periods, the City of God, City of Man coexist. Things can be pretty awful and the church can still survive. That's kind of his vision. Eusebius just thought the reign of Constantine was the greatest thing since sliced bread. He thought the conversion of Constantine to the Catholic faith and the legalization of Christianity in the Roman Empire was just, the
bomb.
That was just the bomb. So he had a much more positive vision of the Christian future. Now, I think history has proven Augustine right. right? Because we know what happened to Byzantium. I mean, it lasted for 1,000 years. It had a pretty good run.
Oh, yeah.
But it ain't eternal.
No, at all. Appreciate that. Thank you so much. Here's a follow-up question, also anonymous. Can one be a full preterist and a Catholic?
Well, it all depends on what you mean by a full preterist. So I have met preterists, typically Protestants, sort of radical Protestants that aren't even well tolerated in their own denominations, that literally believe that every single thing in the New Testament only refers to first century events, and that there's absolutely sort of no forward motion in the thinking of New Testament authors. I don't see how you could hold that position and be a Catholic, because the Catholic Church teaches the doctrine of Christ's return at the end of time and the bodily resurrection. These are Catholic dogmas. And I have known some hardcore preterists to deny those dogmas. That would put them outside the scope of the Catholic faith.
All right, very good. Appreciate all of your questions, whether they're texts or emails or on the phone. But we do have a line open for you right now. If you want to give us a call, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. The Tuesday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. Do stay with us.
Mother Angelica.
We have to get back into our hearts and minds the value of life. If you don't care about the unborn, I don't think you're going to care about the elderly.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
And this is an EWTN bookmark brief. I'm Doug Keck. I just finished speaking with Michael D. Graney about his book, 10 Battles Every Catholic Should Know. That's an entire interview coming soon. But tell us, Michael, why should someone be interested in this book, 10 Battles Every Catholic Should Know?
The first question that pops into most people's minds is, why are you glorifying war? To which I would respond, I'm not glorifying war, and nobody should glorify war. What we should glorify is our response to it. If we meet it with courage and fortitude, no matter how bad it is, it does us good, even if the war itself is not just.
Very good. 10 Battles Every Catholic Should Know. Michael D. Graney is the author. Look for the entire interview coming soon on EWTN. Look for the book through our EWTN Religious Catalog. EWTNRC.com is the place you can pick the book up. This has been an EWTN Bookmark Brief. We appreciate you stopping by. We'll see you next time.
Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
I'm really a revert. There are a lot of converts on Catholic radio, a lot of reverts, those who have come back to the faith. And ever since I came back to a practice of my faith, I started praying the rosary, going to even daily Mass, God has led me on an amazing journey and used me in a lot of incredible ways that I never dreamed would have been possible.
Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, tonight, midnight Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, open forum, first hour Tim Staples, second hour Father Paul Keller. Any question you've got about the Catholic faith, Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David.
Hey, it's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. I want to give a little shout out here to Jerry, who's listening to us on Facebook. She had some questions about the SSPX, the Society of St. Pius X, and we went into great detail on yesterday's show. So, Jerry, we're not going to be able to do that, but I would recommend going to check out the podcast at EWTNradio.net, EWTNradio.net for that question. It is Called to Communion. Here is a question from Rayford, who emailed this one to us. How do we know, this is kind of deep, I want to give you a little warning here, David. How do we know, or how can we prove that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the true God and not the Hindu God, the Buddhist deity, the American Indians deity, or some other deity? Is it possible to be certain without using a proof found in the religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And to finish up, if the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the real God, is it possible that all the other gods are a manifestation of the true God, but so that people of different time and location will have an essence of God? Thanks, Rayford.
Okay, thanks, Rayford. I appreciate the question. So, first of all, let's talk about the Catholic concept of God.
Okay.
The Catholic concept of God. and then how that relates to biblical and historical issues. So, in the Catholic faith, God is understood not as a being among other beings. So, in other words, if you sort of picture in your mind the set of everything that exists, and you've got trees and flowers and radio hosts and microphones and fountain pens and dogs and cats and angels and demons, and then you've got God as one of the members of the set. That's actually not the way Catholics think about it, right? God is the ground, the source, the condition in which the set exists, right? St. Paul says in Acts 17 that in God we live and move and have our being, right? And St. Thomas would follow that up and say that God is the very act of to be. God is subsistent being. God is the analogous to Plato's concept of the good, right? The ultimate first principle from which the entire universe and everything that exists derives its intelligibility, all right? So this is a very subtle doctrine of God. And of course, it goes without saying that such a principle would be immaterial and immense, omnipresent, and so forth, and impassible and unchanging. It's a very, very fine doctrine of God. It also follows that since God is not an object among objects, that the tools of language and thought that we have, which are drawn from creatures and from finite things, and from the process of abstraction from particulars, are not adequate to grasp such a God. We can grasp that there is a God because we know that the universe is intelligible, and if it's intelligible, then it proceeds from a principle. We can grasp that there is a God, but really very little about what God is, just that God is. And in fact, the more we try to pin down the nature and essence of God in fine distinctions, the more our language and concepts tend to break down. And so sometimes it's easier to describe God by what he is not than by what he is. And that tendency in Catholic thinking is called, fancy word here, apophaticism.
Whoa.
All right, the apophatic tradition, or the via negativa, the negative way of describing God by way of negation. Now, do we find anything like that in other religious traditions? And the answer to the question is yes, we do. The Catholic faith is not the only tradition that conceives of God apophatically that way. And you can find that particular way of describing God in the Upanishads, for example, of the Hindus. You can find it in the Tao Te Ching of the Chinese. You can find it in some of the strata of Buddhist scripture. But alongside those descriptions, you can also find a lot of positive content in those traditions that would contradict that idea, right? And so as a Catholic, what do you do with that, with these similarities and differences between religious traditions? Well, you go to St. Paul in Romans chapter 1, who tells us that the being and existence of God can be discerned rationally from the things that have been made. I mean, that's a Catholic doctrine. Natural theology is built into the fabric of reality and to our own consciousness. So if I find similarities in philosophical theology between Catholicism or Hinduism or Judaism or Islam or whatnot, then that actually confirms what the Catholic faith teaches about the knowability of God from natural reason. But remember the ongoing obligation to be endlessly self-critical and to purify my language of God of superstitious secretions, all right? And so that's integral to the Catholic's knowledge of God. Now, how do we come to identify that highly rarefied idea of God with the God of the Bible? Well, Catholic reflection on this begins with Exodus chapter 3, when Moses asks God, well, who are you? And God says, I am who I am. And St. Thomas, of course, goes into ecstasy over that, right? That this is the God who declares his nature as being itself. And of course, we can see this elaborated over the course of the development of biblical theology from God's God as the ground and source of everything that exists, clearly in the Genesis narrative, and his unicity, his immaterial nature, and so forth, and his identification with that which is good, right? And that the moral way the moral path is the path to encountering and coming into relationship with this invisible and at some level unknowable God.
Rayford, thank you so much for your very thoughtful email. We do appreciate that. Let's get back to the phones here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Our number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, lines do tend to fill up rather quickly. Here's your chance to get in right now. Here's Vivian now in Lindenhurst, Illinois, listening on WSFI 88.5 FM, a first-time caller. Hey, Vivian, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I heard an editorial earlier today on this same station, and the man said that exhumation is mandatory to become a saint, and therefore he doesn't want to be cremated. And I've never, ever heard that before. Is that true?
Thank you. So it's part of the process when someone's cause for canonization has been opened. One of the things they do is they do dig up the body and they examine the remains. So does that mean that if you get cremated or you dissolve away that you're out of luck? If you're aiming for formal canonization? And the answer to the question is no, you're not. And in fact, when they went digging up John Henry Cardinal Newman when he was up for beatification, they dug him up and they found absolutely nothing.
Wow.
He'd been vaporized. There was no remains left.
Bye-bye.
So it's not a requirement for canonization that you have intact remains. But naturally, if somebody's going to be declared a saint, you'd like to have their intact remains because, then we start partitioning them up and handing out the relics, and all kinds of good stuff that Catholics do with the remains and bodies of the holy dead. But no, you don't. It's not a requirement for canonization that you actually leave physical remains behind.
Okay. Hey, Vivian, thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here's John who's checking in via YouTube. Could you please describe medieval piety/devotion and specifically the impulse toward practices of venerating relics and seeking the intercession of saints? Why have these practices fallen away?
Oh, great. Love this question. One of my favorite questions. So actually the devotion to the relics of the saints is something that predates medieval piety by a long shot. And it predates Christianity. And we find this impulse in Judaism from the Second Temple period and before, actually. And in fact, the whole idea of reverencing the bodies of the dead, we find all the way back into the Pentateuch. Remember how Joseph tells his brothers in Egypt, when you get out of here, make sure you take my bones with you and bury them in ancestral ground. And so it's been part of the Hebraic tradition for a very long time. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in the show, it's the practice of venerating relics was ubiquitous with the Christian faith in antiquity. So you couldn't go anywhere where there were Christians where they didn't venerate the bodies of the dead. One of the things that Julian the Apostate, the Roman emperor who apostatized from Christianity, one of the things he disliked so much about Catholics was their tendency to carry around dead bones everywhere and venerate saints. So what happened uniquely in the Middle Ages to sort of differentiate from antique piety? We continued to venerate relics, to be sure, and a lot of them. But there was also a tendency in late medieval piety to a more sort of spiritualized identification with the saints and to idealize their lives as exemplars. And this, of course, really took off with respect to the Blessed Virgin Mary, who didn't leave any relics behind, right? She didn't leave any first-class relics. And so medieval piety took on a lot of elements that were distinct. And one of them was the development of the devotional tradition, right? In imitation, really kind of began in imitation of Benedictine monastic piety. The Benedictines would pray the Psalms, every day. That was kind of the work of the monks, and the lay people kind of wanted to get in on that job, but they couldn't do the 150 Psalms in Latin, so they began to pray the Rosary as an alternative. At the time of the Crusades, people would start making pilgrimages to Jerusalem to go venerate the holy places, and not everybody could afford to go to Jerusalem. It's a long walk down there. And so they began the Stations of the Cross as an alternative to that more tactile form of piety. And so we actually began to see more imaginative practices of mental prayer. Of course, Rosary is mental prayer, to supplant the physical, tactile veneration of relics. And so if you read a book like The Introduction to the Devout Life, and this is, post-medieval, this is early modern, Introduction to the Devout Life, or the Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, you'll find that it's these sort of highly sophisticated mental practices of meditative prayer and mental prayer and imaginative piety that have really overwhelmed the question of that sort of tactile devotion to relics. And I think that it is possible to go too far that way and to forget the importance of relics to the Catholic faith. And I think you're right. I think there's been a tendency in modern Catholic piety to so emphasize the sort of spiritually imaginative and interior aspects of the faith that we risk losing touch, if I can use that phrase, with the tactile component.
Sure.
And we need both. We need both.
Absolutely. John, thank you so much for checking us out today on YouTube, and thank you so much for your question. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Get those calls in now if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Have you checked out Church Pop? It's a different way to look at our Catholic faith, featuring new online Christian content that is fun, informative, and inspirational. Some of the stories right now on the homepage: when Mark Wahlberg's brother met Mother Teresa in prison, a powerful Catholic conversion story. Well, I definitely want to read about that. What about this one? Brave nun spray paints inspiring notes on building amid Cincinnati protests in viral video. I've seen a picture of that. Fascinating story. And what about this one? The craziest and wildest Catholic conspiracy theories. It is all there on Church Pop. You'll find it on Snapchat, Instagram, and on the web at churchpop.com. Churchpop.com. It is a part of the EWTN family. Glad you could join us here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Here is Sharon now in Naples, Florida, listening on YouTube. Hey, Sharon, what's on your mind today?
Well, thank you for taking my call. I'm a 40-year convert, a little more than 40 years, and there have been so many changes. We're in Naples, Florida. We are blessed to be able to be in Charleston, South Carolina, a lot of times, where we can receive communion and kneeling and with a paten being used. It just seems that, I don't understand what has happened, that a paten not being used in churches any longer to catch any particle that may fall.
Right. So your question is...
we have to drive 45 or 50, not 45, 50, about an hour and a half away in Naples to get to Ave Maria, where they use a paten and you can receive on the tongue.
Okay.
Yeah, and so how can I help you?
Concerned.
How can I help you?
I just want to... It's hard for me as a convert who loves this church so much to see the disregard in so many of the parishes.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question, and I'm sensitive to the anguish that you feel and your desire to reverence the Blessed Sacrament and to treat the Blessed Sacrament as what it is, which is the very body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. Now, obviously this is a very sensitive topic, and the law of the church, the rubrics for the Mass, permit a certain degree of variation from parish to parish in how we celebrate, and however we do it in whatever parish we go to, we should treat Holy Communion with the utmost reverence and, in fact, worship. I'm a little bit hesitant to equate the worship and reverence that we owe to the Blessed Sacrament with the fine particulars of rubrical form, because those things have some measure of variation built into them, and they have, of course, organically developed over time in the Church's history. I think the most important thing is that the disposition of the heart be profoundly reverent towards the Blessed Sacrament. And rubrics and forms can be a great aid for that and should be obeyed. And the teaching of the Church should be obeyed because it's there for that reason. And yet at the same time, to recognize that the Church does permit some manner of liturgical freedom of action in terms of the celebrant and the choices that he makes as he judges the pastoral need of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have to kind of balance these, and it can be a thorny path. And I'm, fortunately I'm not the bishop and I don't have to tread that path. I'm very glad. So, adore Christ in the Eucharist, pray for the bishops and the priests and for the Catholic faithful and for our own hearts, and let's move forward.
I was at a church this past weekend. It was a vigil mass, and the celebrant was not using a paten, but, I could tell how much he loves our Lord and how much he loves the celebration of the Mass. And, it came out in his homily. It came out in his actions. So, as you say, there is some leeway there.
That's right. And the point of rubrics is to train hearts.
Sure. Okay.
Hearts are where the action ultimately lie.
Sharon, thanks so much for your call. Here now, Hunter in Houston, listening on Guadalupe Radio, a first-time caller. Hey, Hunter, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for the time. So, a couple of things. I know that the Council of Trent teaches that the Mass is a true and proper sacrifice. And I also know that an immolation is like a part of a sacrifice. So my question is, if the separate consecration of the different species is a signification of, I guess, a prior immolation, I'm trying to understand if there's how the Mass is a true and proper sacrifice if there's not, quote-unquote, an actual immolation taking place anymore. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, sure, absolutely. So there most certainly is not a physical destruction of a victim in the sacrifice of the Mass. And the dogma of Trent is extremely clear on that the sacrifice of the Mass is unbloody. It is not a bloody sacrifice. And that it is the resurrected, glorified Christ in heaven who is made present in the elements. And so the death of Christ is presented to us in a symbol of the double consecration of the elements, bread and wine being calling to mind body and blood presented in a state of victimhood or separation, even though the truly present Christ in the sacrament itself is not so separated. Jesus is not separated from his body and blood in the actual sacrament, but he's represented that way as a victim. And so that's the nature of the immolation. It is that presentation, but through the double consecration that presents. In this way, the priest speaks of the Mass as the memorial of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And in that sense, it is a memorial because we call to mind Christ's once-for-all physical death on Calvary, all right, the effects of which are made present to us, the fruits of which are made present to us, and of course the very same victim, Christ himself, who was on Calvary, is made present to us. The same priest who made the offering, namely Christ himself, is present to us in the person of his minister, and for the same intent, namely to atone for sin, bring salvation to the world, also present in the distinct sacrifice of the Mass. So that's the manner. Now, your claim that there must be the physical destruction of the victim for there to be a sacrifice at all, I do not think that is true, right? And we have counterexamples in the Bible. Think about the wave offering of the old covenant. You walk in you wave it around, and you walk out. It's literally, right? With multiple examples of types of sacrifices that did not involve the physical destruction of a living victim. And of course, St. Paul says that we offer our bodies as living sacrifices, that being our spiritual act of worship, Romans chapter 12. Now, that may or may not involve physical immolation, because it could require you to go all the way to martyrdom, and then there would be a kind of immolation. But for many people, the offering of one's body does not entail physical martyrdom, and yet it's still an act of sacrificial worship. And of course, marriage in Ephesians chapter 5 is presented as analogous, right? That one offers one's body to one's spouse as a sacrifice. And in the Anglican tradition, and actually borrow this from antecedent Catholic liturgies, the celebrants, the spouses themselves, say, "With my body I thee worship." And there's that idea that the self-donation of the body in matrimony is a sacrificial act.
All right. John Hunter, thank you so much for your call. Now we're going to go to John in Omaha, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Got about a minute or so. John, what's your question today?
Well, Jesus told us that there will be one flock and one shepherd. Does that mean before the end of the world, everybody will be Catholic?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. Well, we know that at the end of the world, not everybody goes to heaven. We know that.
Right.
So even if everybody were Catholic, that doesn't make everybody saved, right? It is the will of God that all be saved, and it is the will of God that all of those who believe in Christ agree on everything and be publicly united in their profession of the faith. And so as Catholics, we always strive for both of those goals. We want to bring everyone to Christ and everyone to the public profession of the Catholic faith. But we know that in at least one of those, we're not going to succeed. Like, we're not actually going to bring every specific individual to salvation. Some people will be lost. Jesus says the ratio of the damned to the saved is the many to the few. So how that plays out with ecumenism, God only knows, really. Yeah. But we know we know what our job is, and that is ut unum sent, that they may be one.
Yes, indeed. John, thank you so much for your call. David, I got to tell you about this. Joan just checked in with us on Facebook. She says, your program was on my radio when I valet parked my car at the doctor's. The valet lingered in my car. I had the wrong appointment time, so I came back out after about 5 minutes. He apologized for still being in my car, but he was listening to your program. He was very interested and was trying to see what channel I was listening to. I gave him the information, so now you're going to have a new listener, and that's from Joan checking us out on Facebook.
John,
how about that?
I appreciate that. We have had some funny automobile radio stories that have come out of this show.
Truck drivers, too.
Cops.
You bet. Love it all. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We do our program Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern here on EWTN Radio, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern and a best of show Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Always available on demand at EWTNradio.net. On behalf of our great crew, Charles and Ryan and Jeff, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. You have a great day. See you tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion.